Elizabeth Carter's hands trembled as she gripped the carriage door, refusing to step down. 3 years she'd rehearsed this moment, smile, nod, survive. But the man standing on those porch steps wasn't supposed to be there. Nathaniel Whitmore. The man who destroyed her with silence. If you've ever loved someone who vanished without a word, if you've ever needed the truth, more than the comfort of forgetting, stay with me. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Let's see how far this story travels. Elizabeth Carter had promised herself 3 things before she ever stepped foot back in Virginia. She would smile for her sister. She would say nothing about the past. And she would leave the moment the wedding ended, before anyone had the chance to ask her a single question she didn't want to answer. She had kept that promise in her mind for the entire 3-day journey from Charleston. She had kept it while she packed her trunk, while she folded the pale blue dress she planned to wear to Charlotte's rehearsal dinner, while she stared out the carriage window at fields of tobacco rolling past like green water. She had kept the promise right up until the carriage rolled to a stop in front of Whitmore Manor, and she saw him standing on the porch steps. Nathaniel Whitmore. Her hand froze on the carriage door. "Miss Carter," the driver said, glancing back at her. "We've arrived, ma'am." Elizabeth didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the man standing at the top of the steps, one hand resting against the white porch column, the other tucked into his coat pocket, like he was trying to keep it from doing something foolish. He looked older, broader through the shoulders. His jaw was shadowed with the beginnings of a beard he hadn't bothered to shave that morning. But his eyes, those pale gray eyes that used to look at her like she was the only woman standing in any room, those hadn't changed at all. "Ma'am," the driver said again. "I heard you," Elizabeth said quietly. "Give me a moment." She smoothed her gloves. She reminded herself silently, fiercely, that she was 24 years old, not the girl of 21 who used to wait by her window for his letters. She reminded herself that whatever had happened between them was buried now 3 years deep, and that she had not traveled 200 miles to dig it back up. She stepped down from the carriage. Nathaniel didn't move from the porch. He watched her the way a man watches a storm rolling in from a distance, knowing it's coming, knowing there's nothing to be done about it, and still unable to look away. "Elizabeth," he said. Just her name. Nothing else. "Mr. Whitmore," she answered, and she heard how cold it sounded, how deliberately she'd made it sound that way. Something flickered across his face, not quite hurt. Something closer to resignation, like he'd expected exactly this, and had prepared for it, and it had still landed harder than he thought it would. "I didn't know you'd be arriving today," he said. "I didn't know you'd still be living here," she said. "It's my family's land." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "I remember." The silence between them stretched long enough that a servant boy came out to fetch her trunk, and neither of them said anything else until he'd carried it inside. "Bug!" Charlotte Carter came running out of the house before Elizabeth had even climbed the last porch step, her arms already thrown wide, her wedding excitement spilling out of her like she couldn't contain it in her own skin. You came, you actually came," Charlotte said, wrapping her arms around Elizabeth's neck. "Of course I came," Elizabeth said, laughing, despite herself, despite the tightness still sitting in her chest. "You're my sister. I wouldn't miss this for anything." Charlotte pulled back, studying her face the way younger sisters always seem to know exactly where to look. "You saw him already, didn't you?" Elizabeth didn't answer. "Lizzie." "I saw him," Elizabeth admitted. "It's fine. It doesn't look fine." "It will be," Elizabeth said, more to convince herself than her sister. "I'm here for you, not for anyone else." Charlotte studied her a moment longer, then seemed to decide not to push it for now. She looped her arm through Elizabeth's instead and pulled her toward the house. "Come on. I want you to see the dress before Mother finds something wrong with it." Elizabeth let herself be pulled inside, grateful for the distraction, grateful for her sister's chatter filling the space where her own thoughts kept trying to crowd in. But even as Charlotte talked about lace and ribbons and whether the flowers would survive the summer heat, Elizabeth's mind kept circling back to the porch, to the way Nathaniel had said her name like it cost him something to say it, to the fact that he hadn't looked away first. She had. Dinner that evening was a careful performance. Elizabeth sat across the long table from Nathaniel, flanked by her mother on one side and Charlotte's fiancé's younger brother on the other, and she spent the better part of an hour discussing nothing of consequence. The weather, the wedding flowers, whether the summer had been kinder to Virginia than it had been to Charleston. She did not look at Nathaniel more than she had to. He did not look at her more than he had to either. It was Mrs. Whitmore, Nathaniel's mother, who finally broke through the careful distance both of them had built. "Elizabeth, dear," the older woman said, setting down her fork with the particular precision of a woman who had spent decades running a household. "It's been so long since we've had you at this table. Nathaniel, don't you remember how she used to visit every Sunday?" "I remember." Nathaniel said, his voice even. "Such a shame you two lost touch." Mrs. Whitmore continued, oblivious, or perhaps not so oblivious, to the tension pulling tight across the table. "You were such good friends." "We were," Elizabeth said carefully. "Whatever happened?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, and the innocence in her voice was almost convincing. The table went quiet. Elizabeth felt every eye shift toward her, waiting. She felt Nathaniel's gaze land on her face and stay there, and for the first time since she'd stepped out of that carriage, she made herself look back at him. "Life happened, Mrs. Whitmore," Elizabeth said, finally, keeping her voice light, keeping it smooth. "People grow apart. That's all. It wasn't all. Both of them knew it wasn't all. But neither of them corrected her, and the conversation moved on to the wedding flowers again, and Elizabeth spent the rest of the meal with her heart beating too hard in her chest and her hands folded tightly in her lap so no one would see them shaking. She found him on the back terrace after dinner, though she hadn't gone looking for him, or so she told herself. She'd only wanted air. The dining room had felt too warm, too full of unspoken things, and she'd slipped out through the side door while her mother was occupied with the wedding planner, needing a moment where no one was watching her face for cracks. Nathaniel was already there, leaning against the terrace railing, a glass of something amber-colored in his hand that he hadn't touched. Elizabeth stopped in the doorway. She could have turned around. She almost did. "You don't have to leave," Nathaniel said without turning around. "I'll go if you'd rather have the terrace to yourself." "It's your house," Elizabeth said. "You don't have to leave on my account." "I'd rather not have you avoiding me for the next 2 weeks. He said. "It's a small property. We're bound to run into each other." 2 weeks, Elizabeth repeated. "I thought the wedding was in 10 days. "The wedding's in 10 days, Nathaniel said. "But my mother's already planned 4 dinners, a garden party, and something she's calling a bridal luncheon that I'm fairly certain didn't exist before this week." Despite herself, Elizabeth felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "That sounds like your mother." "She's determined to make this the wedding of the summer," Nathaniel said. He finally turned to look at her. "I imagine we'll be forced into each other's company more than either of us would like." "I can manage that," Elizabeth said. "I've managed worse." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a flinch, but close to it. "I imagine you have." Elizabeth crossed her arms, suddenly cold, despite the summer heat still clinging to the evening air. "Why do you say it like that?" "Like what?" "Like you know something about what these 3 years have been for me." "I don't," Nathaniel said quietly. "That's rather the point, isn't it? I don't know anything about your life anymore. I used to know everything." Elizabeth's throat tightened. She hadn't expected him to say something so plainly true, so plainly painful, without any of the careful distance they'd both maintained at dinner. "That wasn't my choice," she said before she could stop herself. "Wasn't it?" "No." Elizabeth said, her voice sharper now. "It wasn't. You ended it, Nathaniel, not me." Nathaniel set down his glass with more force than necessary. "I didn't end anything, Elizabeth. You did." "Excuse me. You sent the letter," Nathaniel said. "You told me you regretted everything. You told me to stop writing to you. I have that letter still, if you'd like me to recite it back to you." Elizabeth stared at him, genuinely confused, now the anger in her chest tangling up with something closer to disbelief. I never sent you a letter like that. Elizabeth, I never wrote it, she said again more forcefully. I waited for you to write to me for 2 months after you stopped. 2 months, Nathaniel. I wrote you 4 letters in that time and received nothing back. Nothing. And then I received 1 letter in your hand telling me you couldn't continue what we had, that you'd made a mistake in encouraging me. That was the last I heard from you until tonight. The color had drained slightly from Nathaniel's face. That's not what happened. That is exactly what happened, Elizabeth said. I have that letter too if you'd like to compare which one of us is remembering it correctly. They stared at each other across the terrace the summer night, suddenly feeling very still, very heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I never wrote you a letter ending anything, Nathaniel said slowly. I received one from you, in your hand. I would swear to it, and I would swear the opposite. Elizabeth said, her voice quieter now, uncertain in a way she hadn't been a moment ago. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Someone is lying, Nathaniel finally said. Either you or me, or... He stopped. Or someone else. Elizabeth finished for him. Elizabeth didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the guest room Charlotte had prepared for her, staring at the ceiling, running the conversation over and over in her mind, until the words stopped making sense from repetition. She had believed for 3 years that Nathaniel had chosen to end things between them. She had built an entire version of herself around that betrayal, a version who didn't trust easily, who kept her guard raised, who had turned down 2 respectable proposals in Charleston, because some part of her still measured every man against the memory of a man who had apparently decided she wasn't worth keeping. And now he was telling her he'd received the opposite letter, that he believed she was the one who'd walked away. It didn't make sense, unless someone had wanted it to happen this way. Elizabeth sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She thought of her own handwriting. How many people had seen it over the years? How many letters she'd written that could have been studied, copied, imitated? She thought of Nathaniel's handwriting, equally familiar to plenty of people in this small corner of Virginia society. Someone had wanted them apart. The question that kept her awake long after the house had gone quiet, long after even the crickets outside her window had settled into their steady nighttime rhythm, was simple and terrible. Who? She found the beginning of her answer 3 days later at the garden party Mrs. Whitmore had insisted on hosting to welcome the wedding guests. Elizabeth stood near the lemonade table, half listening to 2 of Charlotte's friends discuss the upcoming ceremony, when she noticed a young woman approaching, elegant, poised, dressed in soft yellow silk that suited the summer light perfectly. You must be Elizabeth, the woman said, extending a gloved hand with a warm smile. Charlotte's told me so much about you. I'm Clara Bennett. Elizabeth shook her hand, taking in the woman's easy confidence, the way she seemed to belong effortlessly to every conversation she joined. It's lovely to meet you, Miss Bennett. Please call me Clara, the woman said. I've been dying to meet Charlotte's older sister. She speaks of you constantly. All good things, I hope. Elizabeth said, smiling, despite the strange unease already prickling at the back of her neck, though she couldn't have said why. Only good things, Clara said, laughing lightly. Though I confess I was curious to meet you for another reason too. Oh, you and Nathaniel Whitmore were close once, weren't you? Clara said, her tone perfectly casual, perfectly friendly. I've heard the 2 of you were quite devoted to each other years ago. Elizabeth felt her smile tighten at the edges. That was a long time ago. Of course, Clara said, waving a hand, as if brushing away the weight of the question. I only ask because Nathaniel and I have grown rather close this past year. I do hope there's no lingering complication. The word sat heavy in the summer air between them. There's no complication, Elizabeth said evenly. We're simply old acquaintances. Wonderful, Clara said, her smile widening, bright and warm and utterly convincing. I'd hate for anything to disturb the peace before the wedding. It's such a special time for your family. She excused herself a moment later, drifting off toward another cluster of guests with the same effortless grace she'd arrived with, and Elizabeth stood alone by the lemonade table watching her go. There was nothing overtly wrong with what Clara had said, nothing she could point to and name as unkind. And yet something about the exchange sat wrong in Elizabeth's chest, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out in every direction. That evening, walking back from the stables where she'd gone to check on her mare after the long carriage journey, Elizabeth passed close enough to the study window to hear voices inside Nathaniel's low and even, and Clara's bright and light, punctuated by soft laughter. She didn't mean to stop walking. She told herself that later, when she thought back on it. She simply found her feet had gone still beneath her, and her ears had turned toward the window before she could stop them. All. "Don't see why it should trouble you," Clara was saying. "She'll be gone after the wedding. 2 weeks, and then Virginia will be exactly as it was before she arrived." "It's not that simple," Nathaniel's voice answered. "Isn't it?" There was a pause. Elizabeth's heart beat hard against her ribs. "I don't know what it is," Nathaniel said, finally. His voice quieter now, almost too quiet for Elizabeth to catch through the glass. "I thought I understood what happened between us. Now I'm not certain of anything." "You're letting an old wound reopen itself over nothing," Clara said. "Don't let her confuse you, Nathaniel. Whatever she's telling you, it changes nothing about what actually happened." Elizabeth stepped back from the window before she could hear more, her pulse pounding in her ears, her mind racing. How did Clara know what Elizabeth had told him on the terrace? She hadn't told anyone about that conversation. Not Charlotte, not her mother, no one. Which meant either Nathaniel had told Clara himself, or Clara had been listening at doors long before Elizabeth ever thought to. Elizabeth barely touched her supper that night, her mind turning over every detail of what she'd overheard, every small strange thing about Clara Bennett that she'd dismissed as harmless before. The way Clara always seemed to know things she shouldn't. The way she'd appeared at the garden party exactly when Elizabeth was alone. The way she'd mentioned the letters, no, she hadn't mentioned letters at all. She'd only mentioned that Elizabeth and Nathaniel had been close. But something about the careful way she'd said it, the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed a conversation before, having it made Elizabeth's skin prickle with suspicion she couldn't yet prove. She excused herself early, claiming a headache from the summer heat, and retreated to her room. But instead of sleeping, she sat at the small writing desk by the window and pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her. She wrote her own name slowly, carefully, the way she always signed her letters. Then she thought of the letter Nathaniel claimed to have received, the one supposedly in her hand, telling him she regretted everything. She had never seen that letter. She had no way of knowing what it said, what it looked like, whether the hand that wrote it truly resembled her own. But she knew one thing, with sudden absolute clarity. If someone had forged her handwriting well enough to fool Nathaniel Whitmore, a man who had once known every curve and slant of her penmanship better than she knew it herself, then whoever had done it had studied her closely, had access to her letters, had reason enough and patience enough to destroy something that had nothing to do with them at all. Elizabeth set down her pen, her hands finally steady for the first time since she'd stepped off that carriage. She had come to Virginia to attend her sister's wedding. She had not expected to find herself investigating the destruction of her own heart. But she would not leave in 10 days without an answer. Whatever it cost her, whatever truth it forced into the light. Someone had taken 3 years from her, and from Nathaniel Whitmore, both of them believing lies about the other, both of them carrying wounds that were never truly their own to bear. She intended to find out who, and she intended to make certain that whoever it was would not walk away from the wedding untouched. Elizabeth woke before the sun that morning, her mind already racing before her eyes had fully opened. She lay still for a moment, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of the guest room, and let the events of the night before settle over her like a weight she couldn't shake off. Someone had forged her handwriting. Someone had destroyed 3 years of her life with a single letter, and Nathaniel's life along with it. She dressed quickly, her hands moving faster than her thoughts could keep up with, and by the time she made her way downstairs, Charlotte was already sitting at the breakfast table picking at a plate of eggs she clearly had no appetite for. "You look terrible," Charlotte said, not unkindly, the moment Elizabeth sat down across from her. Thank you, Elizabeth said dryly. That's exactly what a woman wants to hear before her sister's wedding. I mean it in the nicest way possible, Charlotte said. You look like you didn't sleep at all. I didn't, Elizabeth admitted. Charlotte set down her fork. Is this about Nathaniel? Elizabeth glanced around the breakfast room, making sure none of the servants were close enough to hear before she leaned forward and lowered her voice. Charlotte, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Of course. Do you remember 3 years ago when Nathaniel and I stopped writing to each other? Charlotte's expression shifted careful now, the way it always did when Elizabeth brought up a subject the whole family had learned not to touch. I remember you were heartbroken for months. I remember Mother wouldn't let anyone mention his name at the dinner table. Do you remember anyone asking about our letters? Anyone who might have seen them or handled them before they reached us? What kind of question is that? Please, Charlotte, it matters. Charlotte thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. The post came through the usual route. Mr. Adler at the post office in town, same as always. I don't know who else would have touched them. She paused. Why are you asking this now, after 3 years? Because I don't think Nathaniel ended things between us, Elizabeth said quietly. I think someone made it look that way. Charlotte's fork clattered against her plate. What? Keep your voice down. Elizabeth, that's... Charlotte lowered her voice to a fierce whisper. That's an enormous thing to say. Do you have proof? Not yet, Elizabeth said, but I intend to find some. She found Nathaniel in the stable yard an hour later, checking the shoes on one of his horses, with the quiet, methodical focus of a man trying very hard not to think about anything else. I want to see the letter, Elizabeth said without preamble. Nathaniel looked up startled. Good morning to you too. Nathaniel. The letter. The one you said was in my hand. He straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth hanging from his belt. It's in my study. I kept it. You kept it for 3 years. I kept all of them, Nathaniel said, and something in the way he said it made Elizabeth's chest tighten unexpectedly. Every letter you ever sent me. I couldn't bring myself to burn them even after. Elizabeth swallowed hard, pushing down whatever feeling had risen in her throat. Show me. They walked to the house together close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed far enough apart that neither of them acknowledged it. The study was dim curtains half drawn against the morning sun, and Nathaniel crossed to a locked drawer in his desk, retrieving a small key from his waistcoat pocket. Here, he said, pulling out a folded yellowed piece of paper and handing it to her carefully as though it might crumble if handled roughly. Elizabeth unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting looked like hers. It looked unnervingly, disturbingly like hers. The same slant, the same careful loops on her lowercase letters, the same way she crossed her T's with a short, decisive stroke. But as she read the words themselves, something cold settled in her stomach. I have come to realize that what we shared was a mistake born of youth and foolishness. I no longer wish to continue our correspondence. Please do not write to me again. I regret ever encouraging feelings I did not truly hold. I never wrote this, Elizabeth said, her voice shaking. Nathaniel, I swear to you, I never wrote a single word of this. I believe you, Nathaniel said quietly. She looked up at him surprised. You do. I didn't 3 years ago. I convinced myself I did believe it because the handwriting looked so much like yours and because I couldn't think of any other explanation. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. But last night after you left the terrace, I sat awake thinking about it. About how strange it was that you would write something so cold, so final, when everything before that had been... He trailed off. Had been what? Elizabeth asked softly. Warm, Nathaniel said. Everything before that letter had been warm, Elizabeth. Every letter you ever sent me was full of laughter, full of plans, full of things you wanted us to do together once your father gave his blessing. And then suddenly nothing. Just this. He gestured at the paper in her hands. It never made sense. I told myself it did, because the alternative was unbearable. What alternative? That someone had done this to us on purpose, Nathaniel said. That someone had taken something good and destroyed it deliberately, and that I had let them succeed by believing a piece of paper over the woman I loved. The word hung between them, loved, and neither of them moved to acknowledge it, though Elizabeth felt it land somewhere deep in her chest, somewhere she'd thought had gone numb years ago. "I need to see your letter too," she said instead. "The one you supposedly sent me." "I never sent you anything after our last real letter," Nathaniel said. "The one you say you received ending things, I never wrote it." "Then someone forged your hand as well," Elizabeth said slowly. "Someone skilled enough to imitate both of us convincingly." Who would do such a thing? Elizabeth thought of Clara Bennett's easy smile at the garden party, the careful way she'd steered the conversation toward Elizabeth and Nathaniel's past, the conversation she'd overheard through the study window the night before. "I have a suspicion," Elizabeth said, "but I'm not ready to say it aloud yet. Not until I have proof." Proof, Elizabeth quickly discovered, was harder to find than suspicion. She spent the following 2 days observing Clara Bennett with the careful attention of a woman who had decided to trust nothing on its surface. She watched Clara at breakfast, charming Mrs. Whitmore with compliments about the wedding preparations. She watched her at the afternoon tea, Charlotte's future mother-in-law hosted, laughing at all the right moments, asking all the right questions, never once putting a foot wrong. It was maddening. Clara was on every visible level exactly what she appeared to be. Gracious, warm, endlessly likable. But small things kept catching in Elizabeth's memory like splinters. The way Clara had known at the garden party that Elizabeth and Nathaniel had been devoted to each other. A detail that wasn't common knowledge outside their two families, since both households had been careful not to discuss it publicly after the engagement fell through. The way Clara's handwriting, which Elizabeth glimpsed briefly when the younger woman signed a note to Mrs. Whitmore regarding flower arrangements, showed a peculiar, practiced neatness. The kind of neatness that came from someone who had trained their hand deliberately, rather than simply writing the way most people did with natural imperfections and small inconsistencies. Elizabeth mentioned this to Nathaniel on the third evening, finding him again on the terrace after supper, though this time she made no pretense of having come out for air alone. "Her handwriting is too perfect," Elizabeth said, sitting beside him on the stone bench without waiting to be invited. "Every letter identical to the last. Real handwriting isn't like that. Mine isn't. Yours certainly isn't. You've been studying her handwriting." "I've been studying everything about her," Elizabeth said. "Someone forged both of our letters, Nathaniel. Someone with the patience to study our handwriting closely enough to imitate it convincingly. That kind of skill doesn't happen by accident." "You think it's Clara?" "I think it's possible," Elizabeth said carefully. "I don't have proof, but everything about the timing fits. She arrived in Virginia society not long after our engagement ended. She's grown close to your family since. And there's something about the way she talks about our past that feels rehearsed, like she's reciting facts she memorized rather than simply repeating gossip she overheard." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark fields beyond the terrace. "She's been kind to my mother," he said finally. "Genuinely kind as far as I can tell. My mother adores her. That doesn't mean she isn't capable of cruelty toward someone else." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It doesn't." "Have you and she—" Elizabeth stopped herself, unsure how to finish the question, unsure if she even had the right to ask it. "Have she and I, what?" "Clara said the two of you had grown close this past year," Elizabeth said carefully. "I only wondered—" "We've spent time together," Nathaniel said. "My mother has encouraged it. I haven't discouraged it because I convinced myself there was no reason to. But there's never been anything between us that resembled what you and I had. I want you to understand that clearly." Elizabeth felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been wound tight since the garden party. "I wasn't asking out of jealousy," she said, though the lie sat awkwardly on her tongue. "Weren't you, Nathaniel?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice now, something that reminded her painfully of who he used to be before 3 years, and a stolen letter had come between them. I only meant to say that whatever you were asking, the answer is the same. There's never been anyone else. Not really. Not in 3 years. Elizabeth looked away toward the dark fields, unable to hold his gaze, while her heart did something complicated and unwelcome in her chest. We need proof, she said finally, steering them both back toward safer ground. Suspicion isn't enough. If we're wrong about her, we'll have accused an innocent woman of something monstrous, and there will be no taking that back. How do we find proof? I don't know yet, Elizabeth admitted, but I intend to find out. The opportunity came sooner than Elizabeth expected, though not in the way she would have chosen. 4 days before the wedding, Mrs. Whitmore hosted what she called a bridal luncheon. A gathering of nearly 20 women from Virginia's finest families, all crowded into the Whitmore Manor drawing room to celebrate Charlotte's impending marriage with tea cake and an overwhelming quantity of unsolicited advice about married life. Elizabeth found herself seated near Clara for most of the afternoon, an arrangement she suspected Mrs. Whitmore had orchestrated without any awareness of the tension it created. "You've been rather quiet today, Elizabeth," Clara said at one point, leaning close enough that only Elizabeth could hear her. "Is everything well?" "Perfectly well," Elizabeth said. "I'm only tired. The wedding preparations have been more exhausting than I expected. I imagine being back at Whitmore Manor brings up all sorts of old feelings," Clara said, her voice light, almost sympathetic. "It must be strange for you being here again, seeing Nathaniel every day." "We manage," Elizabeth said carefully. "Of course you do," Clara said, smiling. "You always struck me as a very capable woman from what I've heard. The sort of woman who handles difficulty with grace." She paused, sipping her tea. "It's a shame things didn't work out between the two of you all those years ago. Nathaniel was quite devastated, I understand. Took him nearly a year to seem himself again." "Is that so?" Elizabeth said, keeping her voice neutral, though every word Clara spoke felt like she was testing the edges of something, probing for a reaction. "Oh yes," Clara said. "I only heard about it secondhand, of course, since I didn't know either of you back then. But apparently the letter you sent him was rather harsh. Not that I'm judging you for it. Sometimes the truth simply must be said, however unkind it sounds." Elizabeth's teacup went very still in her hand. "The letter you sent him." She had never told Clara about the letter. She hadn't discussed it with anyone except Charlotte and Nathaniel, and she was certain, absolutely certain, that neither of them would have repeated the details to Clara Bennett. "How do you know about the letter?" Elizabeth asked, keeping her voice as light as she could manage, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she was certain Clara could hear it. Something flickered across Clara's face, so brief, so quickly smoothed over, that Elizabeth almost missed it. But she didn't miss it. She had spent 3 days watching this woman closely enough to catch even the smallest crack in her composure. "Nathaniel must have mentioned it," Clara said smoothly. "We've spoken about a great many things in our time together." "Nathaniel doesn't discuss that letter with anyone," Elizabeth said. "He told me so himself." Clara's smile stayed perfectly in place, but her eyes had gone sharp, calculating, entirely different from the warm expression she'd worn a moment before. "You must be misremembering what he told you, Elizabeth. It's understandable. This whole situation must be terribly difficult for you." "I'm not misremembering anything," Elizabeth said quietly. "I want to know how you know the contents of a letter that supposedly came from my own hand 3 years before you and I had ever met." For just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, Clara Bennett's mask slipped entirely. Elizabeth saw it. The coldness underneath the warmth, the calculation underneath the kindness. Then it was gone, replaced instantly by wide-eyed innocence. "I don't know what you're implying, Elizabeth, but I find it rather insulting. I've been nothing but kind to you since you arrived." "I haven't implied anything," Elizabeth said. "I've only asked a question." "Perhaps we should rejoin the others," Clara said, rising from her seat with practiced grace. "I wouldn't want anyone to think we were arguing on such a happy occasion." She walked away before Elizabeth could say another word, gliding back into the crowd of chattering women with the same effortless charm she'd arrived with. Elizabeth sat frozen for a long moment, her tea going cold in her hands, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. She knew about the letter. She slipped just for a moment, and I saw something underneath the mask. It wasn't proof, not the kind that would convince anyone else. But it was enough to confirm in Elizabeth's own mind that her suspicions weren't the product of grief or bitterness or wishful thinking. Clara Bennett knew something, and whatever she knew, she was determined to keep hidden. Elizabeth told Nathaniel everything that evening, finding him in the study poring over ledgers. He clearly wasn't reading his mind visibly elsewhere. She knew about the specific contents of the letter, Elizabeth said, closing the study door behind her. Not just that a letter existed, the actual wording. She said it was harsh. She implied I'd been cruel in how I ended things. Nathaniel set down his pen slowly. That's not something I've discussed with her. I know. I've never shown that letter to anyone but you. I know that too. Then how? I think she wrote it, Elizabeth said. I think Clara Bennett wrote both of those letters, Nathaniel, yours and mine. I think she studied our handwriting closely enough to forge it convincingly, and I think she's been living with that secret for 3 years, watching us both suffer for something she did. Nathaniel's face had gone pale. Why would she do such a thing? She didn't even know either of us 3 years ago. Didn't she? Elizabeth said. Are you certain of that? Do you know where Clara Bennett came from before she arrived in Virginia society last year? Nathaniel frowned, thinking. I believe her family is from Richmond. Her father does business with several families in the area. I don't know much more than that, honestly. She simply appeared at gatherings one season, and everyone seemed charmed by her, and I never thought to question it further. I think we need to find out more, Elizabeth said. About her family. About where she was 3 years ago when our letters stopped coming. About anything that might connect her to either of us before she supposedly appeared out of nowhere. How do you propose we do that? Elizabeth thought for a moment. The postmaster, she said finally. Mr. Adler. He's handled the mail in this county for 20 years. If any letters passed through his hands that shouldn't have, if anyone intercepted our correspondence before it reached us, he might remember something. It's been 3 years, Nathaniel said doubtfully. That's a great deal to ask a man to remember. It's worth trying, Elizabeth said. I don't see another way to find real proof. Mr. Adler turned out to be a small, wiry man with spectacles perched low on his nose, and a memory considerably sharper than either Elizabeth or Nathaniel had dared to hope. They found him at the post office the following morning, and though he seemed surprised by their sudden interest in mail delivered 3 years prior, he didn't hesitate to help once Nathaniel explained carefully, and without too many specifics, that they were trying to sort out a family matter. 3 years back, Mr. Adler said, scratching his chin thoughtfully. That'd be, let's see, the summer your correspondence with Miss Carter stopped rather sudden, if I recall right. I remember, because you used to come in near every day that spring, Mr. Whitmore checking for letters, like a man waiting on news from the war. Do you remember anything unusual about that time? Elizabeth asked. Anyone collecting mail who shouldn't have been? Mr. Adler's brow furrowed as he thought back. There was a young woman, he said slowly. Came in a few times that summer, asking after mail for the Whitmore family. Said she was helping out running errands, that sort of thing. I didn't think much of it at the time. Plenty of families send someone to collect their post when they're occupied. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. Do you remember what she looked like? It's been a long while, Mr. Adler said apologetically. But I recall she was young, well-dressed, spoke real proper, like she'd been raised with money. He paused, thinking harder. Come to think of it, she had dark hair. Pretty thing. Charming way about her, if I remember right. Talked me into handing over the Whitmore correspondence without so much as a note of permission from the family, and I didn't think twice about it until years later, if I'm honest. When it occurred to me, I probably shouldn't have done that. Do you remember her name? Nathaniel asked, his voice tight. Mr. Adler shook his head slowly. Can't say I do. It was a long time ago, and she only came in those few times. Would you recognize her if you saw her again? Elizabeth pressed. Mr. Adler considered this. Perhaps, he said. I couldn't swear to it in a court of law, mind you. But there was something about her manner I might remember if I saw it again. Elizabeth exchanged a look with Nathaniel, and she saw her own thoughts reflected back in his eyes. There's a wedding luncheon tomorrow, Nathaniel said carefully, at Whitmore Manor. Would you be willing to attend Mr. Adler as a favor to my family? That's a rather unusual request, Mr. Whitmore. I understand, Nathaniel said, but it would mean a great deal to us both. Mr. Adler studied the two of them for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more to this request than either of them had said aloud. But whatever he saw in their faces, the desperation, the quiet urgency seemed to convince him. I suppose I could manage it, he said finally. For an hour or two at least. The following afternoon, Elizabeth's nerves were stretched so tight she could barely sit still through the wedding luncheon, watching the door every few minutes for Mr. Adler's arrival, watching Clara Bennett across the room, with an intensity she hoped wasn't visible to anyone else. When Mr. Adler finally arrived, escorted in by a servant and looking distinctly uncomfortable in his formal coat, Elizabeth felt her heart lurch into her throat. She caught Nathaniel's eye across the room and gave the smallest nod. Nathaniel crossed to Mr. Adler, engaging him in quiet conversation, gradually steering him toward the cluster of women, where Clara stood laughing at something Mrs. Whitmore had said. Elizabeth watched, holding her breath, as Mr. Adler's gaze swept across the group. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, Mr. Adler's eyes settled on Clara Bennett, and Elizabeth saw the small, unmistakable widening of recognition cross his face. He said nothing immediately. He simply stood there staring, his expression shifting from confusion to slow dawning certainty. Clara, noticing the attention, turned toward him with her usual warm smile. I don't believe we've met, she said. No, Mr. Adler said slowly. I don't believe we have, though I could have sworn. He trailed off, shaking his head. Forgive me. You have a familiar look about you is all. Do I? Clara said, her smile never wavering, though Elizabeth, watching closely, saw something tighten almost imperceptibly around her eyes. The post office, Mr. Adler said suddenly, as if the memory had clicked into place all at once. 3 years back, near enough. You came in asking after the Whitmore mail. I remember now you had a different way of styling your hair back then, but it's you sure as I'm standing here. The color drained from Clara Bennett's face. The drawing room, which had been full of chattering voices a moment before, went gradually uncomfortably quiet as more people noticed the strange exchange unfolding. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Clara said, her voice higher than usual, tighter. I've never set foot in your post office in my life. I don't forget faces easily, miss, Mr. Adler said, apologetic but firm. And I don't forget the particular way a person talks either. You talked me into handing over correspondence that wasn't addressed to you. I remember it plain as day now that I'm looking at you. This is absurd, Clara said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land, glancing around at the gathered guests with something close to panic flickering beneath her composure. I don't know what this man is talking about. Clara, Nathaniel said quietly, stepping forward. Is there something you'd like to tell us? Every eye in the room turned toward Clara Bennett. I have no idea what any of you are suggesting, Clara said, but her voice had lost its usual warmth entirely, now replaced by something brittle and defensive. This is a wedding luncheon. I don't understand why an old man's confused memory should be entertained as, he's not confused, Elizabeth said, stepping forward to stand beside Nathaniel. You knew the contents of a letter you had no reason to know about. You've been asking careful questions about our past since the moment you arrived, and now a man who has worked at the county post office for 20 years recognizes you as someone who intercepted mail addressed to this family 3 years ago. How much more do you think we need before we understand exactly what happened to us? Clara's composure cracked just for a moment, and Elizabeth saw real fear flash across her face before it was replaced by something colder, harder. You don't know anything, Clara said, her voice low now, dangerous. You don't know what you're accusing me of." "Then tell us," Nathaniel said. "Tell us we're wrong. Tell us there's a reasonable explanation for all of this, and I promise you, I will believe you if you can give me one." Clara looked around the room at the dozens of eyes fixed on her, at Mrs. Whitmore's stricken face, at the wedding guests who had come expecting celebration, and found themselves witnesses to something else entirely. "This isn't the place for this conversation," Clara said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Then where is?" Elizabeth asked. Clara didn't answer. She turned and walked quickly from the room, her silk skirts rustling with every furious step, leaving behind a drawing room full of stunned silence and a truth that had finally begun, after 3 long years, to claw its way into the light. Mrs. Whitmore found Elizabeth alone on the terrace an hour later, her face still pale with shock. "I don't understand," the older woman said, sitting heavily beside Elizabeth on the stone bench. "Clara has been nothing but kind to this family. I brought her into our home. I trusted her." "I know this is difficult to hear," Elizabeth said gently. "Do you truly believe she did this forged letters between you and my son?" "I believe the evidence is pointing very clearly in that direction," Elizabeth said. "I don't say it lightly, Mrs. Whitmore. I understand what it means to accuse someone of something so serious." Mrs. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening fields. Why would she do such a thing? What could she possibly have gained from tearing the two of you apart? Elizabeth had asked herself the same question 100 times in the past few days, and she still didn't have a complete answer. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I intend to find out before this wedding takes place." "You think this concerns the wedding?" "I think," Elizabeth said slowly, "that whatever Clara Bennett wants, it involves this family, and I don't believe she's finished trying to get it." Nathaniel found Clara that evening alone in the garden behind the manor house, standing rigidly near the rose bushes with her arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the warm summer air. "You owe us an explanation," he said, approaching slowly. Clara didn't turn around immediately. When she finally did, her face had none of its usual warmth, none of its careful charm. What remained was something harder, more desperate, the mask finally stripped away entirely. "You don't understand what it was like," Clara said, her voice trembling with an emotion Nathaniel couldn't quite identify. "Watching you with her. Watching everyone talk about the two of you like you were destined for something the rest of us could never have." "Clara, I didn't even know you then." Clara continued, the words spilling out now like a dam had finally broken. "Not really. I'd seen you at a gathering once before Elizabeth ever came into the picture, and I thought—" She stopped, shaking her head bitterly. "It doesn't matter what I thought. What matters is that by the time I properly met your family, you were already promised to her in everything but name, and you decided to destroy it." Nathaniel said, his voice hard now, disbelieving. "You decided that because you wanted something you couldn't have, you would take it from someone else instead." "I didn't think it would last this long," Clara said, tears finally spilling down her carefully composed face. "I thought I don't know what I thought. That you'd move on eventually. That I could make myself into someone you'd choose once she was out of the way. You forged her handwriting. You forged mine. You stole years from both of us." "I know what I did," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I've known for 3 years, Nathaniel. Do you think it's been easy watching the two of you circle each other with all this grief neither of you understood? Do you think I haven't regretted it every single day?" "Regret doesn't undo what you took from us," Nathaniel said. Clara wiped at her face, some of her composure returning, though what remained now was brittle and defensive rather than warm. "What do you intend to do?" "Tell everyone ruin me in front of the entire county." "I don't know yet," Nathaniel said honestly. "But I know this. Whatever happens next, you will not stand at my sister-in-law's wedding pretending nothing happened. You will not smile at my mother as though you haven't spent 3 years lying to her face." "And Elizabeth?" Clara asked quietly. "What does she intend?" Nathaniel thought of Elizabeth's face that afternoon in the drawing room, steady and unshaken, even as the truth had finally cracked open in front of dozens of witnesses. He thought of her insistence days before that they needed proof, real proof, before either of them accused anyone of something so serious. "Elizabeth believes in the truth," Nathaniel said, "and I imagine she intends to see all of it brought into the light, whatever that costs you." Clara's face went very pale in the fading evening light. "There's more," she said quietly. "More than just the letters. If you truly want the whole truth, Nathaniel, you should ask Elizabeth to look more carefully at who benefits from this wedding taking place exactly as planned." Nathaniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" But Clara only shook her head, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. "Ask her," she said. "Ask Elizabeth to look at the marriage contracts. Ask her to look at who arranged the match between her sister and my cousin in the first place." "Your cousin," Nathaniel repeated slowly. "Charlotte's fiancé is your cousin." Something like grim satisfaction flickered across Clara's tear-streaked face. "You didn't know that, did you?" she said. "Neither of them mentioned it, I'd wager. Ask Elizabeth to look closer at the wedding she came all this way to celebrate, Nathaniel. You might find there are more secrets in this family than the ones I've already confessed to." She turned and walked away before he could ask another question, leaving him standing alone among the roses, with a new, unwelcome fear settling into his chest. He found Elizabeth minutes later, still on the terrace, where he'd left her, and the look on his face must have told her something was wrong before he even spoke. "What happened?" she asked, rising immediately from the bench. "Clara said something," Nathaniel said slowly. "About your sister's wedding. About her fiancé being connected to Clara's family somehow." Elizabeth went very still. "What kind of connection?" "She said he's her cousin," Nathaniel said. "She told me to ask you to look more closely at the marriage contracts, at who arranged the match in the first place." Elizabeth's mind raced back through everything she knew about Charlotte's engagement. How quickly it had come together the previous winter, how eager their mother had seemed for the match, how little anyone in the family actually knew about the young man Charlotte was set to marry in 6 days' time. "I need to see those contracts," Elizabeth said, her voice suddenly urgent. "Tonight, if possible." "Why, what are you thinking?" Elizabeth looked toward the house, toward the warm glow of candlelight in the windows, where her sister was likely sitting at that very moment, dreaming happily of a wedding day that suddenly felt far less certain than it had that morning. "I'm thinking," Elizabeth said grimly, "that Clara Bennett may not be the only person in this house who wanted something from this family. And I don't intend to let my sister walk into a marriage built on the same kind of lies that destroyed 3 years of my own life." The marriage contracts were kept in her mother's traveling desk, a small locked box that had accompanied the Carter family everywhere for as long as Elizabeth could remember. She waited until the house had gone quiet, until she was certain her mother had retired for the night, and then she slipped down the darkened hallway toward the room where her mother slept. "Lizzie?" Elizabeth froze her hand halfway to the door. Charlotte stood at the end of the hallway in her nightgown, a candle in one hand. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and concern. "What are you doing?" "I couldn't sleep," Elizabeth said, which was not entirely a lie. "You're standing outside Mother's room in the middle of the night," Charlotte said. "That's not couldn't sleep, that's something else. What's going on, Lizzie? First that awful scene with Clara at the luncheon, and now this. You've been strange since you arrived." Elizabeth studied her sister's face in the flickering candlelight, weighing how much to tell her. Charlotte was 20 years old. In 6 days, she was meant to marry a man Elizabeth was no longer certain any of them truly knew. And whatever Elizabeth found in those contracts, Charlotte deserved to hear about it from her sister, rather than discover it on her own. "Come with me," Elizabeth said quietly. "But you have to promise to stay calm, no matter what we find." "Find where?" "Mother's desk." Charlotte's eyes widened. "You want to go through Mother's private papers?" "Elizabeth, those are her—" "They concern your marriage, Charlotte," Elizabeth said, "which makes them your business as much as hers." Charlotte hesitated, the candle trembling slightly in her hand. Then slowly she nodded. The lock on the traveling desk was old and simple, and Elizabeth had it open within minutes, using a hairpin, a skill she'd learned as a girl and never expected to need again. Inside, beneath a stack of household accounts and personal correspondence, she found what she was looking for. A folded set of documents bound with ribbon, the marriage contract between Charlotte Carter and Mr. Thomas Gray. Gray, Elizabeth murmured, unfolding the papers. That's his name, Thomas Gray. You know his name, Charlotte said, half offended. I know very little about him, Elizabeth admitted, scanning the document by candlelight. Which struck me as strange the moment I arrived. Your own sister and I've barely heard a word about the man you're set to marry beyond his name, and the fact that he's from a good family. She read faster now, her eyes moving down the page, and then she stopped. What? Charlotte asked. What is it? Elizabeth's finger rested on a line near the bottom of the contract. This says the marriage settlement includes the transfer of your dowry, plus the deed to the Carter family land in Loudoun County, to be held in trust by the groom's family until such time as an heir is produced. Charlotte frowned. The Loudoun land, that's Father's land. The land he left to... She stopped. That land was meant to come to you, Elizabeth. Father left it to you in his will. I know, Elizabeth said quietly. So why is it written into your marriage contract as part of your dowry? The two sisters stared at each other in the candlelight, the same terrible question dawning in both their eyes. Mother wouldn't, Charlotte whispered. She wouldn't give away your inheritance without telling you. Wouldn't she? Elizabeth said. She kept reading, her heart pounding harder with every line. There's a clause here I don't understand. Something about a prior agreement dated last spring arranged by... She squinted at the small, cramped handwriting. Arranged by a family representative acting on behalf of both parties. What does that mean? It means someone brokered this marriage, Elizabeth said slowly. Someone acted as a go-between, arranging the match, negotiating the terms. And whoever it was, they arranged for my inheritance to become part of your dowry. She looked up at her sister. Charlotte, who introduced you to Thomas Gray. Charlotte's face went pale. It was through a family friend. Someone Mother knew. A young woman who'd recently come into society who said she knew a respectable young man looking for a wife. Elizabeth felt the cold certainty settle into her bones before Charlotte even said the name. Clara, Charlotte whispered. It was Clara Bennett who introduced us. Elizabeth didn't sleep at all that night. She sat with Charlotte in the guest room until nearly dawn, the two of them piecing together everything they now understood and everything they still didn't. Clara had introduced Charlotte to Thomas Gray. Clara had claimed Thomas was her cousin. Clara had 3 years earlier forged the letters that tore Elizabeth and Nathaniel apart. And now a marriage contract sat in their mother's desk, transferring Elizabeth's rightful inheritance into a dowry for a marriage Clara herself had arranged. None of this is coincidence, Elizabeth said, watching the sky lighten beyond the window. It can't be. She's been circling this family for years, Charlotte. First Nathaniel and me, now you and Thomas Gray. Whatever she's after, she's been working toward it for a very long time. But what is she after? Charlotte asked, her voice small and frightened. What could she possibly want that's worth all of this? That, Elizabeth said grimly, is exactly what I intend to find out. She confronted her mother at breakfast, laying the marriage contract on the table between them without a word of preamble. Margaret Carter went very still at the sight of it. Where did you get that? Your desk, Elizabeth said, which I understand was a violation of your privacy, and I'll accept whatever anger you have for me later. But right now, Mother, I need you to explain to me why my inheritance, the Loudoun land Father left specifically to me, is written into Charlotte's marriage contract as part of her dowry. Her mother's hands trembled as she reached for the document. It's not what you think, Elizabeth. Then tell me what it is. Margaret Carter was quiet for a long moment, her face drawn and older than Elizabeth had ever seen it. After your father died, she said slowly, there were debts. More than any of us knew. Your father had made investments that failed, borrowed against the estate to cover them. By the time the lawyers finished sorting through everything, we were nearly ruined. Elizabeth stared at her mother. You never told me any of this. You were grieving, Margaret said. You'd just lost your father, and then that terrible business with Nathaniel Whitmore left you heartbroken on top of it. I didn't want to add to your burden. And then you left for Charleston, and I thought—" Her voice caught. "I thought I could manage it on my own. Protect you both from the worst of it." "By selling my inheritance," Elizabeth said, her voice cold now, hurt bleeding through despite her efforts to keep it steady. "By securing your sister's future," Margaret corrected sharply. "Thomas Gray's family is wealthy, Elizabeth. The marriage settlement clears our debts entirely. It secures Charlotte a comfortable life, and yes, it required the Loudon land as part of the arrangement because without it, the Gray family wouldn't agree to the match. You gave away my land to pay for a marriage I knew nothing about," Elizabeth said. "I gave away land you weren't even living on to save this family from ruin," Margaret shot back. "You were in Charleston, Elizabeth. You'd built a whole life away from us. What was I supposed to do, write to you and ask permission to save us from the poorhouse?" "Yes," Elizabeth said. "That's exactly what you should have done." The two women stared at each other across the breakfast table, 3 years of distance and unspoken grief hanging heavy in the air between them. It was Charlotte who broke the silence. "Mother," she said quietly from the doorway where she'd been standing unnoticed. "Do you know who arranged the match? Do you know who brought Thomas Gray to us?" "A young woman named Clara Bennett," Margaret said. "She came to me last spring. Said she knew of a respectable young man from a wealthy family looking to marry. She helped negotiate the terms. She was very helpful." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Why do you ask?" "Because Clara Bennett is the woman who forged the letters that ended things between Elizabeth and Nathaniel 3 years ago," Charlotte said. "And now we've discovered she also arranged my marriage. Which means, Mother, that everything about this, the debts, the settlement, all of it may not be what it appears to be at all." Margaret Carter's face drained of color. "That's not possible. Clara has been nothing but kind," Elizabeth finished. "Yes, that seems to be her particular talent, making everyone believe she's kind while she rearranges their entire lives to suit her purposes." Elizabeth found Nathaniel in the stable yard that morning and told him everything. The contract, the debts, her mother's confession, Clara's role in arranging Charlotte's marriage. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every detail. "She's been planning this for years," he said when Elizabeth finished. "Whatever this is, I still don't understand what she gains," Elizabeth said. "She tore us apart, yes. But how does arranging Charlotte's marriage to Thomas Gray benefit Clara Bennett? Unless—" She stopped, a new thought striking her. "Unless Thomas Gray isn't who he claims to be either." "You think Clara's cousin is part of this?" "I think," Elizabeth said slowly, "that we've been assuming Clara acted alone this whole time. But what if she didn't? What if there's someone else? This Thomas Gray or someone behind him, and Clara has simply been the one doing the visible work. Then we need to find out who Thomas Gray really is," Nathaniel said. "Before he stands at the altar with your sister in 5 days' time." Elizabeth nodded. "I have never even met the man properly. He's been staying at an inn in town, apparently only coming to the manor for planned visits. Charlotte says he's charming, attentive, everything a young woman could want in a husband." She paused. "Which, given everything else we've learned, worries me more than it reassures me." "Charming and attentive," Nathaniel repeated. "The same words everyone used about Clara." "Exactly. They arranged to meet Thomas Gray that afternoon under the pretext of a family dinner welcoming Elizabeth back into the fold. Charlotte, still shaken but determined, agreed to help to watch her fiancé closely, to note anything that struck her as false, now that she had reason to look for it. Thomas Gray arrived promptly at 5, a handsome young man of perhaps 28, with an easy smile and a manner so smooth it set Elizabeth's teeth on edge the moment he walked through the door. "Miss Carter," he said, taking Elizabeth's hand and bowing over it with practiced grace. "Charlotte has told me so much about her accomplished older sister. It's an honor to finally meet you." "The honor is mine," Elizabeth said, watching his face closely. "I confess I know very little about you, Mr. Gray. Charlotte's letters were rather sparse on details." There's not much to tell, Thomas said with a modest laugh. I'm a simple man from a Richmond family. I met your sister at a gathering last winter and knew almost immediately that I wanted to spend my life with her. A gathering, Elizabeth said. Arranged by your cousin, I understand. Miss Bennet. Something flickered behind Thomas Gray's eyes, so brief, Elizabeth almost missed it. Clara, yes. She's been a great help in bringing Charlotte and me together. You must be very close, you and your cousin. We grew up together, Thomas said smoothly. More like siblings than cousins, truly. Elizabeth smiled, keeping her expression pleasant, even as her mind worked furiously. How lovely. And your family in Richmond, I don't believe I've heard the Gray name mentioned in society before. Where exactly is your family's estate? For just a fraction of a second, Thomas Gray hesitated. North of the city, he said. A modest property. We keep to ourselves mostly. Of course, Elizabeth said. It's only that my late father did a great deal of business in Richmond over the years. I wondered if he might have known your family. I doubt it, Thomas said a touch too quickly. As I said, we keep to ourselves. Elizabeth let the subject drop, but she caught Charlotte's eye across the table, and she saw that her sister had noticed the same thing. She had, the hesitation, the vagueness, the careful way Thomas Gray avoided offering a single, verifiable detail about himself or his supposed family. Later that evening, after Thomas Gray had departed, Elizabeth and Nathaniel compared notes in the study. He's lying, Elizabeth said flatly, about everything. His family, his history, all of it. He couldn't name his own estate without hesitating. I noticed the same, Nathaniel said. And there's something else. When I mentioned to him earlier that my family has known nearly every prominent Richmond family for 2 generations, he changed the subject immediately. A man with a genuine Richmond pedigree would have been eager to establish the connection. He avoided it entirely. So Thomas Gray isn't a wealthy young man from a respectable Richmond family, Elizabeth said. Which means the entire premise of Charlotte's marriage, the settlement, the clearing of our debts, all of it is built on a foundation of lies. But how does that benefit anyone? Nathaniel asked. If Thomas Gray has no real wealth, then the marriage settlement can't actually clear your family's debts. There's no money to... He stopped. Elizabeth had gone very still, a terrible understanding dawning across her face. Unless the point was never the money, she said slowly. Unless the point was the land. The Loudon land. Think about it, Elizabeth said, her voice rising with urgency. The marriage contract transfers the deed to my inheritance into the groom's family's trust. If Thomas Gray and his so-called family have no real wealth, then they weren't paying to marry into ours. They were positioning themselves to steal the only valuable asset we have left. My land. The land Father left to me. They arranged debts that didn't need to exist, Nathaniel said, following the logic. Or exaggerated debts that did. Convinced your mother she had no choice but to marry Charlotte off. Provided a wealthy-seeming groom to make the match respectable. And wrote the contract so that the moment the wedding takes place, control of your land passes to them. And then presumably Thomas Gray disappears, Elizabeth said grimly. Or the marriage falls apart somehow, or an heir is never produced, and the land remains in trust with the groom's family indefinitely. Either way, the Carters lose everything, and Clara Bennet, and whoever she's working with, walk away with the only thing worth taking. The two of them sat in stunned silence for a moment, the full shape of the scheme finally clear before them. We have to stop the wedding, Nathaniel said. We have to prove all of this first, Elizabeth countered. It's not enough to suspect it. If I go to my mother with suspicions, she'll accuse me of trying to sabotage Charlotte's future out of bitterness over my own broken engagement. I need proof. Something undeniable. Where do we find proof of something like this? Elizabeth thought hard, running through everything they knew. Clara said there was more to the story. She told you to look at the contracts at who arranged the match. She wanted us to find this. She frowned. Why would she point us toward evidence of her own crime? Perhaps she's not working with Thomas Gray after all, Nathaniel said slowly. Perhaps she's working against him now. Perhaps something changed. Or perhaps, Elizabeth said, she's afraid of him, and she's using us to do what she can't do herself. Elizabeth found Clara the next morning at the inn in town, having risen before dawn and ridden into the village alone, telling no one where she was going. Clara answered the door of her rented room, looking as though she hadn't slept in days, her usual composure gone entirely dark shadows beneath her eyes. "You've come to gloat," Clara said flatly. "I've come to understand," Elizabeth said. "May I come in?" Clara hesitated, then stepped aside. "You told Nathaniel to look at the marriage contracts," Elizabeth said once the door was closed. "You wanted us to find out about Thomas Gray. Why?" Clara sat down heavily on the edge of the narrow bed, wrapping her arms around herself, in a gesture Elizabeth was beginning to recognize as her tell the thing she did when the mask cracked and the frightened woman underneath showed through. "Because I'm in over my head," Clara said quietly. "And I don't know how to get out." "Start from the beginning," Elizabeth said, sitting in the room's single chair. "The letters, 3 years ago. Tell me the truth this time, all of it." Clara was silent for a long moment. Then slowly the truth began to spill out of her. "Thomas Gray isn't my cousin," she said. "He's my husband." Elizabeth went very still. "Your husband. We married 4 years ago," Clara said. "Secretly, my family would never have approved. He had no money, no name, nothing. But he was charming, and I was young and foolish, and I believed every word he told me about the life we'd build together." She laughed bitterly. "It didn't take me long to learn what he really was. A man who lives by taking things from other people, marriages, inheritances, whatever he can get his hands on through charm and deception." "And the letters?" Elizabeth pressed. "You forged the letters between Nathaniel and me. Why?" Clara's face crumpled. "That was Thomas's idea at the beginning. He learned that you were the heir to valuable land, the Loudon property. He thought if he could break your engagement to Nathaniel Whitmore, leave you unattached and vulnerable, he might find a way to maneuver himself into your life instead. Marry you, take the land directly." She swallowed hard. "I was the one who could imitate handwriting. I'd always had a talent for it. So he had me forge the letters, destroy what you and Nathaniel had so he could move in. But he didn't marry me," Elizabeth said slowly. "I left for Charleston." "You left," Clara agreed. "And Thomas's plan fell apart. You were gone out of reach, and the land stayed tangled up in your father's estate. For a while, he abandoned the whole scheme." Her voice hardened. "But then your father died, and the debts came to light. And Thomas saw a new way in. He couldn't marry you directly, you were too far away, too guarded. But your sister was here, young, trusting, eager to marry well. So he became Thomas Gray, respectable young man from Richmond, and I became his cousin, who introduced him into society. And we arranged everything." Elizabeth felt sick. "You ruined my life, then came back 3 years later to ruin my sister's." "I know," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face now. "I know what I've done, and I've hated myself for every moment of it. But you don't understand, Elizabeth. I couldn't refuse him. He's my husband. He controls everything. Where I go, what I do, who I speak to. I've spent 4 years as a prisoner in a marriage I can't escape, forced to help him destroy one family after another." "Then why help us now?" Elizabeth asked. "Why point us toward the contracts? Why confess any of this?" Clara looked up, and there was something desperate in her eyes. "Because I met your sister," she said. "And she's kind. Genuinely kind. In a way I haven't seen in a very long time. And I watched her fall in love with a monster believing every lie he told her, the way I did 4 years ago. And I couldn't—" Her voice broke. "I couldn't do it again. I couldn't help destroy another woman the way Thomas destroyed me. So I gave you the thread to pull. I hoped you'd unravel it before it was too late." Elizabeth studied Clara's tear-streaked face, weighing everything she'd heard, searching for the lie beneath the confession. "If what you're telling me is true," she said slowly, "then help me prove it. Give me something I can use. Because right now, all I have is your word, and your word is worth very little after everything you've done." Clara wiped at her face, then rose and crossed to a small trunk in the corner of the room. She unlocked it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck and withdrew a bundle of papers. "These are his," she said, holding them out to Elizabeth. "Letters between Thomas and his associates, records of the other families he's done this to, and—" she hesitated. "And proof that Thomas Gray isn't even his real name. That the man about to marry your sister is already legally married, to me." Elizabeth took the papers with trembling hands. "This would make his marriage to Charlotte bigamous, illegal, void." "It would," Clara said. "It would expose him completely. But Elizabeth, you have to understand, the moment you use these, Thomas will know it was me, and I don't know what he'll do." Fear flooded her face. "He's not a violent man usually, but he's never been cornered like this before. I don't know what he's capable of when he has nothing left to lose." Elizabeth clutched the papers to her chest, her mind racing. "Then we'll have to make certain he has no chance to do anything," she said. "We'll expose him publicly in front of witnesses before he understands what's happening. Somewhere he can't lie his way out and can't hurt anyone." Where? Elizabeth thought of the wedding 4 days away now. Of the entire county gathered to celebrate. Of Thomas Gray standing at the altar believing himself moments away from stealing everything the Carter family had left. "The wedding," she said slowly. "We expose him at the wedding, in front of everyone." But when Elizabeth returned to Whitmore Manor that afternoon, papers hidden carefully in her saddlebag, she found the household in chaos. Charlotte met her at the door, her face streaked with tears. "Thomas came this morning," she said, "while you were gone. He and Mother spoke privately for over an hour, and now Mother says the wedding has to be moved up, to tomorrow. Thomas insists on it." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. "Tomorrow? Why?" "He says there's urgent business calling him back to Richmond," Charlotte said. "That he can't wait another 4 days. Mother agreed. She's already sent word to the guests." Charlotte gripped Elizabeth's arm. "Lizzie, what's happening? Why does everything feel so wrong?" Elizabeth's mind raced. Thomas Gray had moved up the wedding, which meant one of two things: either he sensed the walls closing in and wanted to complete the theft before anyone could stop him, or Clara had somehow given herself away, and he now knew exactly how much danger he was in. "Where is Thomas now?" Elizabeth asked urgently. "He left, said he'd return this evening to finalize arrangements with Mother." Charlotte searched Elizabeth's face. "Elizabeth, please, tell me what's going on. You've been keeping something from me, and I can't bear it any longer." Elizabeth made her decision. "Come with me," she said, pulling Charlotte toward the study. "You need to see something, and then you need to be very, very brave." She spread Clara's papers across the study desk and told Charlotte everything. The forged letters, the debts, Thomas Gray's true identity, his secret marriage to Clara, the entire scheme laid bare. Charlotte read the documents in stunned silence, her face growing paler with every page. When she finally looked up, her hands were shaking. "He never loved me at all," she whispered. "Everything he said, every word, it was all—" "A lie?" Elizabeth said gently. "I'm so sorry, Charlotte. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way." Charlotte set down the papers, and for a moment, Elizabeth braced herself for tears, for heartbreak, for the collapse of a young woman who'd just learned the man she loved was a fraud. But instead, something hardened in Charlotte's face, something Elizabeth recognized because she'd felt it herself the night she first understood she'd been betrayed. "He's coming back tonight," Charlotte said, her voice steadier now. "To finalize the arrangements. What do we do?" "We can't confront him tonight," Elizabeth said. "Not alone, not without witnesses. If he suspects, we know he could destroy the evidence or flee or worse. We need him exposed publicly where he can't escape and can't deny it." "At the wedding," Charlotte said, understanding. "At the wedding," Elizabeth confirmed. "Tomorrow, in front of the entire county. We let him believe he's won right up until the final moment. And then we tear the whole thing apart in front of every witness in Virginia." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the enormity of what her sister was proposing. "You want me to stand at that altar?" she said slowly. "To walk down the aisle toward a man I know is a criminal. To pretend in front of everyone that I'm about to marry him." "I know it's a great deal to ask," Elizabeth said. "If you can't, I'll do it," Charlotte said firmly. Elizabeth blinked. "Charlotte? He took your happiness 3 years ago." Charlotte said, her young face set with a determination Elizabeth had never seen in her before. "He tried to take mine, and he tried to steal everything Father left this family. I'm not going to hide from him, Elizabeth. I'm going to look him in the eye at that altar, and I'm going to be the one who ends it." Elizabeth felt a surge of fierce pride for her sister, along with a fresh wave of fear for what tomorrow would bring. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said. "Nathaniel needs to know all of this, and we'll need Mr. Adler as a witness and the papers, and—" She stopped, her mind organizing the pieces. "It has to be perfect, Charlotte. If we expose him, and it doesn't hold, if he finds some way to talk his way out, he'll have every advantage. We only get one chance at this. Then we make it count," Charlotte said. That evening, Thomas Gray returned to Whitmore Manor, as promised, all charm and warmth, embracing Charlotte as though he were the most devoted fiancé in Virginia. Elizabeth watched from across the room, her stomach churning with the effort of pretending, of smiling, of playing her part in the performance they'd all agreed to give. "Miss Carter," Thomas said, crossing to her with his easy smile. "I trust you've made peace with our accelerated timeline. I do apologize for the rush, but business waits for no man." "Not at all, Mr. Gray," Elizabeth said smoothly. "I'm simply glad to see my sister so happy. It's all I've ever wanted for her." "You're very kind," Thomas said. Something in his eyes, though a flicker of calculation of assessment, told Elizabeth he didn't entirely trust her sudden warmth. "Charlotte tells me you rode into town this morning, quite early." Elizabeth's heart skipped, but she kept her expression serene. "I did. I've an old friend staying at the inn. We knew each other in Charleston. I wanted to see her before the wedding swept away all my free time." "How lovely," Thomas said, watching her closely. "And who might this friend be? I know several families with connections to the inn." "I doubt you'd know her," Elizabeth said lightly. "She keeps to herself mostly." The irony of using Thomas's own evasion against him was not lost on Elizabeth, and for a moment she saw uncertainty flicker across his face, as though he sensed something beneath her pleasant words, but couldn't quite grasp what. "Of course," he said finally. "Well, I look forward to becoming your brother tomorrow, Miss Carter." "As do I, Mr. Gray," Elizabeth said, and she smiled at him with everything she had. Thinking of the papers hidden in her room, of Clara, weeping in that inn, of 3 years of her life stolen by this man and the woman he'd forced to do his bidding. Tomorrow, she thought, holding his gaze. Tomorrow you learn what it costs to take what isn't yours. Thomas Gray smiled back, entirely unaware that the woman before him had already dismantled his entire scheme, that the papers to destroy him sat waiting in the room above his head, that in less than a day, every lie he'd built his life upon would come crashing down in front of the whole of Virginia society. He raised his glass to her in a small, confident toast. Elizabeth raised hers in return, and beneath the careful calm of her expression, her heart beat with the cold, certain rhythm of a woman who had finally, after 3 long years, found her way back to the truth, and intended to make certain it was spoken aloud, no matter what it cost, no matter who tried to stop her. Elizabeth barely slept that night, and when she did, she dreamed of forged letters and locked drawers, and a man raising a glass to her across a candlelit room. She woke before dawn, with her heart already racing, the weight of what the day would bring settling over her like a stone. Everything had to go perfectly. There was no room for error, no second chance if the plan fell apart. She found Nathaniel waiting for her in the stable yard, exactly where she'd asked him to be, the gray light of early morning just beginning to touch the horizon. "Is it done?" she asked. "Did you speak to Mr. Adler?" "He's coming," Nathaniel said. "He'll be at the church before the ceremony, along with 2 other men from town who witnessed Thomas Gray's dealings over the years. I found them through Adler men who were cheated by a man matching Gray's description under different names in different counties." He held up a folded paper. One of them recognized the sketch Clara gave us. He's willing to testify that Thomas Gray defrauded his family 2 years ago in Fredericksburg, under the name Thomas Ashford. Elizabeth's breath caught. Then we have more than just Clara's word. We have independent witnesses. We have enough to bury him, Nathaniel said grimly. If everything holds. Elizabeth nodded, clutching the bundle of Clara's papers tighter to her chest. Charlotte is ready. She's frightened, but she's ready. She's going to walk down that aisle as though nothing is wrong, and Thomas won't suspect a thing until it's far too late. And your mother? Elizabeth's expression tightened. I haven't told her. I couldn't risk it. She's been so certain about this marriage, so desperate for it to save us, that I was afraid she'd warn Thomas without meaning to. She'll find out with everyone else. That's a great deal to keep from your own mother. I know, Elizabeth said quietly. And she may never forgive me for it. But I'd rather have her angry and safe than trusting and ruined. Nathaniel studied her face in the growing light. You've thought of everything. I've had 3 years of thinking about betrayal, Elizabeth said. I've become rather good at anticipating it. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, a tenderness that caught her off guard. Elizabeth, he said, whatever happens today, don't, she said softly. Not now. If we start down that road now, I'll lose my nerve for what has to be done. Let me get through today first. Please. Nathaniel nodded slowly. After then. After, Elizabeth agreed. The church filled slowly through the morning, the entire county turning out to witness the marriage of Charlotte Carter to the mysterious, charming Thomas Gray. Elizabeth stood near the front, her face a careful mask of sisterly joy, her hand pressed against the papers hidden beneath her shawl. Clara arrived just before the ceremony, slipping into a pew near the back, her face pale and drawn. When her eyes met Elizabeth's across the crowded church, she gave the smallest nod. She came, Elizabeth thought, relief flooding through her. She's going to see it through. She'd half expected Clara to lose her nerve to flee in the night, rather than face the man who'd controlled her for 4 years. But there she was, sitting rigidly in the back of the church, ready to confront her own husband in front of the entire county. Mr. Adler sat 2 rows behind Clara, and beside him 2 men Elizabeth didn't recognize, but understood to be the witnesses Nathaniel had gathered. Everything was in place. Thomas Gray stood at the front of the church, resplendent in his wedding finery, his easy smile fixed on his face as he greeted well-wishers and accepted congratulations with practiced grace. He looked, Elizabeth thought, exactly like a man who believed he was moments away from claiming everything he'd worked years to steal. He had no idea. The organ began to play. The crowd rose to their feet, and at the back of the church, Charlotte appeared on their mother's arm, radiant in white, her face composed into a picture of bridal happiness that Elizabeth knew cost her sister everything to maintain. Charlotte walked down the aisle slowly, her chin high, her eyes fixed on Thomas Gray, with an expression that could easily have been mistaken for love. Elizabeth alone knew it was something else entirely. It was the look of a woman walking toward the thing she intended to destroy. Charlotte reached the altar. Their mother placed Charlotte's hand in Thomas's, beaming with a joy that made Elizabeth's chest ache because she knew how quickly it was about to shatter. The minister began to speak, his voice carrying through the hushed church. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Elizabeth's heart pounded. She'd told Charlotte to wait to let the ceremony proceed almost to its conclusion, to the moment where the minister asked if anyone present knew of any reason the marriage should not take place. That was the moment. That was when everything would come crashing down. The minister's words washed over the congregation. Elizabeth barely heard them. Her entire body was coiled tight, waiting. If any person can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The church went silent. Elizabeth stepped forward. I can, she said, her voice ringing out clear and steady through the stunned silence. I can show just cause. Every head in the church turned toward her. Thomas Gray's easy smile froze on his face. Elizabeth, Her mother said, her voice sharp with confusion and rising alarm. "What are you doing?" "I'm stopping this marriage, Mother," Elizabeth said, "because the man standing at this altar is a fraud and a criminal, and my sister will not marry him." A ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the congregation. Thomas Gray recovered his composure with the smoothness of a man who talked his way out of 100 tight corners. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I understand this is an emotional day, but these are serious accusations. Perhaps we should discuss whatever's troubling you privately, rather than—" "His name isn't Thomas Gray," Elizabeth said, ignoring him entirely, addressing the congregation. "He has no family estate in Richmond. He's a swindler who has spent years marrying his way into families, stealing their inheritances and disappearing. He's done it under a dozen names across a dozen counties." "This is absurd," Thomas said, but there was an edge to his voice now, a crack in the smoothness. "I won't stand here and be slandered by a bitter, jealous—" "And he cannot marry my sister," Elizabeth continued, her voice rising over his, "because he is already married." The church erupted. Thomas Gray's face had gone white. "You have no proof of any of this," he snarled, the charming mask falling away entirely now. "These are the ravings of a jealous spinster who couldn't keep a man of her own." "I have all the proof I need," Elizabeth said, and she pulled the bundle of papers from beneath her shawl, holding them up for all to see. Records of his frauds, letters in his own hand, and a marriage certificate 4 years old binding him to a woman who sits in this very church. Elizabeth turned toward the back of the church. "Clara, please stand." Every eye followed Elizabeth's gaze. Slowly trembling, Clara Bennett rose to her feet. "This is Clara," Elizabeth said. "Not Thomas Gray's cousin as he's claimed to all of you. His wife. Married to him for 4 years. Which makes his engagement to my sister not only a lie, but a crime." The murmurs of the crowd rose to a roar. Mrs. Whitmore had gone pale. Charlotte's mother, Elizabeth's mother, stood frozen at the altar, her hand pressed to her mouth, staring between Thomas and Elizabeth as the ground shifted beneath everything she'd believed. "Clara," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous, now all pretense of charm abandoned. "What have you done?" Clara flinched at the sound of his voice, but she didn't sit back down. "I've told the truth, Thomas," she said, her voice shaking but audible. "For the first time in 4 years, I've told the truth." "You forget yourself," Thomas said, taking a step toward her. "You forget what happens to women who cross me." "Take another step and you'll answer for it," Nathaniel said, moving from his place to stand between Thomas and the aisle, his voice hard as iron. "You're finished, Gray, or Ashford, or whatever name you're using this week. Half the men in this church have heard the accusations now. You won't be talking your way out of anything." Thomas Gray's eyes darted around the church, searching for an exit, for an ally, for any way out of the trap that had closed around him. But there was none. Mr. Adler had risen from his pew. The 2 witnesses stood beside him. "That's the man," one of them said loudly, pointing at Thomas. "Thomas Ashford. Swindled my brother's family out of their farm in Fredericksburg 2 years back. Married my niece, took the deed, vanished before the ink was dry on the papers. That's him. I'd know that face anywhere." "And I remember him too," said the other. "Cheated the Morrison family in Culpeper. Same scheme, same lies." The church had become a storm of voices, of accusations, of gasps and cries of disbelief. Thomas Gray stood at the center of it all, his charming mask shattered completely, revealed at last as the criminal he'd always been. "You can't prove any of this holds," he said desperately, backing toward the side of the altar. "Accusations mean nothing without—" "The magistrate has already been sent for," Nathaniel said. "He'll be here within the hour, and I imagine he'll be very interested in these papers, and in the testimony of these gentlemen, and in the marriage certificate binding you to a woman you tried to pass off as your cousin." He took a step forward. "It's over, Gray. There's nowhere left to run." For one long, terrible moment, Thomas Gray stood frozen, and Elizabeth saw him calculating, weighing his chances, searching for any last thread to pull. Then he lunged, not toward the door, toward Clara, his face contorted with rage, his hands reaching as though to silence the woman who'd finally betrayed him. You ungrateful! Nathaniel caught him before he'd taken 3 steps, seizing his arm and wrenching it behind his back with a force that sent Thomas crashing to his knees on the church floor. 2 other men rushed forward to help pinning the struggling con man down as the congregation watched in stunned silence. You're done, Nathaniel said, his voice low and even, holding Thomas fast. You'll answer for every family you destroyed, every lie you told, every life you stole. It's finished. Thomas Gray stopped struggling, and as the fight went out of him, as he knelt on the floor of the church he'd meant to steal a fortune in, something broke in his expression. Not remorse, but the cold, empty realization of a man who'd finally run out of lies. The next hour passed in a blur of chaos. The magistrate arrived and took Thomas Gray into custody, along with the papers Elizabeth had provided and the testimony of the assembled witnesses. The wedding guests dispersed slowly, buzzing with the scandal they'd witnessed spreading word across the county before the day was even half over. Charlotte stood at the front of the emptying church, still in her wedding gown, and when the last of the guests had gone, she finally allowed herself to crumble. Elizabeth caught her sister as she sagged, holding her tight as 3 days of held-back fear and heartbreak finally broke free. You did it, Elizabeth whispered, stroking Charlotte's hair. You were so brave. It's over now. He can't hurt any of us anymore. I loved him. Charlotte wept. That's the worst part, Lizzie. I know what he is now. I know it was all lies, but I loved him, and he never felt anything at all. I know, Elizabeth said softly, her own heart aching with the memory of a betrayal she understood too well. I know exactly how that feels, and I promise you it will hurt for a long time, but you survived it. You didn't just survive it, you were the one who ended it. Do you understand what that means? He didn't destroy you, Charlotte. You destroyed him. Charlotte pulled back, wiping her eyes, and something steadied in her expression. We did, she said. Together. Their mother approached slowly, her face ashen, her whole body seeming to have aged a decade in the span of an hour. Elizabeth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You knew all of this, and you didn't tell me. I couldn't, Mother, Elizabeth said, releasing Charlotte gently and turning to face the woman she'd deceived. I'm sorry. I know how much this hurts. But if I'd told you I was afraid you'd confront him, or warn him, or refuse to believe me, and any of those things would have given him the chance to escape or destroy the evidence, or hurt someone. I couldn't take that risk. Not with everything at stake. Margaret Carter stared at her daughter, and Elizabeth braced herself for anger, for accusations, for the cold fury she'd feared for days. Instead, her mother began to cry. I almost married her to a criminal, Margaret whispered. I almost gave away your inheritance and married your sister to a thief, and I did it because I was too proud and too frightened to tell either of you the truth about our situation. She reached out and gripped Elizabeth's hands. I've made such a mess of everything. Your father would be ashamed of me. No, Elizabeth said firmly. No, Mother. Father would understand. You were trying to protect us the only way you knew how. You were wrong about how you went about it. You should have told us the truth both about the debts and about everything else. But you weren't wrong to try to save this family. You just trusted the wrong person to help you do it. Clara Bennett, Margaret said bitterly. Clara Bennett, Elizabeth agreed. Who I'm about to go speak with, because there's still one part of this story that hasn't been settled. Elizabeth found Clara sitting alone in a pew near the back of the empty church, staring at her hands as though she didn't quite know what to do with herself, now that the thing she'd both feared and hoped for had finally come to pass. He's gone, Elizabeth said, sitting down beside her. The magistrate has him. He'll stand trial for what he's done. To you, to us, to all the others. I know, Clara said quietly. I saw them take him. You're free of him now. Clara laughed, a hollow, broken sound. I helped him destroy your life 3 years ago. I helped him try to destroy your sister's. Being free of Thomas doesn't undo any of that. I'll answer for what I've done too, as I should. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, studying the woman beside her. The woman who had forged the letters that stole 3 years from her, who had ruined her engagement, who had returned to help destroy her sister's happiness as well. By every reasonable measure, Elizabeth should have hated her. And yet, you could have stayed silent, Elizabeth said slowly. This morning, you could have let the wedding proceed, let Thomas take the land, and no one would ever have known you had a hand in any of it. Thomas would have vanished. You'd have gone with him, and my family would have been ruined, and you'd have escaped clean. She turned to face Clara. Why didn't you? Clara was silent for a long time. Because I was tired, she said finally. Tired of being the woman who destroys other people's happiness. Tired of watching Thomas ruin lives and hating myself for helping him. Tired of being a prisoner, too afraid to fight back. She looked up, tears standing in her eyes. Your sister was kind to me, Elizabeth. She had no idea who I was or what I'd done, and she was kind to me anyway. And I couldn't be the reason another good woman was destroyed. Not again. I'd rather answer for my crimes than carry one more of them. Elizabeth considered this. You forged those letters 4 years ago, when you were 20. Married to a man who controlled everything about your life. That's not an excuse. No, Elizabeth agreed. It isn't, but it's an explanation, and it matters. She was quiet for a moment. When the magistrate takes your statement, I'm going to tell him the truth. That you were coerced by your husband. That you came forward of your own free will at great personal risk. And that your testimony is the reason Thomas Gray will face justice. I'm going to ask him for leniency on your behalf. Clara stared at her disbelieving. Why would you do that? After everything I took from you? Because, Elizabeth said slowly, working it out even as she spoke. I spent 3 years believing Nathaniel had abandoned me. 3 years of bitterness and grief over something that was never even true. And that grief nearly turned me into someone hard and closed off and incapable of trusting anyone. She looked at Clara steadily. I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you, Clara. It would poison me more than it would ever punish you. You did a terrible thing, several terrible things. But you also risked everything to make one of them right. And I've decided that has to count for something. Not everything, but something. Clara's face crumpled, and she pressed her hands to her mouth, weeping in a way that seemed to release 4 years of fear and self-loathing all at once. Thank you, she whispered when she could finally speak again. I don't deserve it, but thank you. Don't thank me yet, Elizabeth said, rising to her feet. You'll still answer for what you did. There will be consequences, but you'll face them as a woman who chose in the end to do the right thing. That's more than Thomas Gray can say. That evening, after the magistrate had come and gone, after Charlotte had finally cried herself to sleep, and their mother had retreated to her room to sit with the wreckage of everything she'd believed, Elizabeth found herself once again on the terrace where so much of this had begun. Nathaniel was there, as she'd somehow known he would be. It's over, Elizabeth said, coming to stand beside him at the railing. Truly over. Thomas is in custody. The land is safe. Charlotte is heartbroken but free, and the truth is finally out. It is, Nathaniel agreed. He was quiet for a moment. You were extraordinary today, Elizabeth. The way you stood up in that church in front of everyone. The way you'd planned every piece of it. I don't know another soul who could have done what you did. I had help, Elizabeth said. You, Charlotte, Mr. Adler, even Clara in the end. You held it all together, Nathaniel said. Everyone else played their part, but you were the one who saw the whole picture, who refused to let the lie stand no matter what it cost you. Elizabeth was quiet, staring out at the dark fields. Earlier, Nathaniel said carefully, I started to say something and you asked me to wait, to get through the day first. I remember. The day's over. Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster. It is. Nathaniel turned to face her fully. 3 years ago, he said, I let a piece of paper convince me that the woman I loved had stopped loving me. I didn't fight for you. I didn't come to Charleston and demand an explanation. I didn't refuse to believe a letter that contradicted everything I knew about you. I simply accepted the lie because it was easier than the terrifying possibility that something was wrong. His voice grew rough. That's the thing I'll never forgive myself for, Elizabeth. Not that I was deceived, that I gave up so easily, that I didn't trust what we had enough to question a single letter. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes. Nathaniel, I'm not asking you to forget it, he said quickly, or to forgive it even. I know 3 years is 3 years, and I know I can't give them back. I only wanted you to know that I understand exactly what I did wrong, that I've understood it every single day since you stepped out of that carriage and I saw your face again. He swallowed hard. I loved you then. I never stopped. And if there's any part of you that could— Stop, Elizabeth said softly. Nathaniel stopped his expression, bracing for rejection. I'm not saying no, Elizabeth said. I want you to understand that. But I'm not ready to say yes either. Not tonight. Not after everything today has been. She took a breath. 3 years ago, I would have thrown myself into your arms the moment you said those words. But I'm not that girl anymore, Nathaniel. I've built a life. I've learned to stand on my own. And I've learned that love without trust, without courage, without the willingness to fight for it, that kind of love isn't enough. It breaks the moment someone tests it. I understand, Nathaniel said quietly. I don't think you do, Elizabeth said. Not yet. So let me be clear about what I need. She turned to face him fully. I need to know that the man asking me to trust him again is not the same man who gave up on me 3 years ago. I need to see it, Nathaniel, not hear it. See it. In how you act, in how you fight for what matters, in whether you have the courage to choose me, even when it's difficult. She held his gaze. Today was a good beginning. You stood between my sister and a dangerous man. You gathered witnesses. You didn't hesitate. That's the man I could learn to trust again. But one good day doesn't undo 3 bad years. Do you understand? Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. You want me to prove it? I want you to mean it, Elizabeth corrected. Proving it is just how I'll know. Then I'll mean it, Nathaniel said, for as long as it takes, however long it takes. Elizabeth studied his face in the darkness, searching for the certainty she needed to see, and finding at last the beginnings of it. Then we'll see, she said softly. We'll see what comes next. And for the first time in 3 years, standing on that terrace with the man she'd never quite stopped loving, Elizabeth Carter allowed herself to feel something she'd long since buried beneath her grief and her guardedness. She allowed herself to feel hope. The weeks after the wedding that never happened moved slowly for the Carter family each day, carrying the weight of everything that had come apart and everything that still needed rebuilding. Thomas Gray, whose real name they eventually learned was Thomas Ashford, a man wanted in 3 counties under 4 different aliases, stood trial before the magistrate a fortnight later. Elizabeth attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the front row, watching as one family after another came forward to testify about the man who had charmed his way into their lives and stolen everything they had. Clara testified too. She told the whole truth this time without flinching, without protecting herself. She described how Thomas had married her when she was barely 19, how he'd controlled every aspect of her life, how he'd forced her to forge letters and impersonate relatives and play whatever role his schemes required. And when the prosecutor asked her why she'd finally come forward, why she'd risked everything to expose the man who controlled her, Clara looked across the courtroom directly at Elizabeth. Because someone showed me that it's never too late to choose the truth, she said. Even when it costs you everything, especially then. The magistrate sentenced Thomas Ashford to 15 years. As they led him from the courtroom in chains, he turned once, searching the crowd, and his eyes found Elizabeth's. Elizabeth did not look away. She held his gaze steadily, without fear, without triumph, until the guards pulled him through the door and out of her life forever. He wanted you to be afraid, Nathaniel said quietly, sitting beside her. Even now, even beaten. I know, Elizabeth said. That's why I didn't give him the satisfaction. Clara's own sentence was far lighter. On account of her testimony, her coercion, and Elizabeth's own impassioned plea to the magistrate on her behalf, she was given 2 years, but the magistrate, moved by the circumstances, suspended the sentence entirely on the condition that she leave Virginia and begin her life anew, somewhere far from the man who'd controlled her. Elizabeth found Clara packing her few belongings at the inn the day before she was set to leave. "Where will you go?" Elizabeth asked from the doorway. Clara looked up startled. She'd clearly not expected to see Elizabeth again. "West," she said. "I have a cousin in Ohio, a real one this time. She's offered to take me in until I find my feet." She hesitated. "I didn't think you'd come." "Neither did I, honestly," Elizabeth admitted. She stepped into the room. "But I found I couldn't let you leave without saying something." Clara set down the dress she'd been folding. "You've already given me more than I deserve, Elizabeth. Your mercy in that courtroom." "That's not what I came to say," Elizabeth interrupted gently. "I came to say thank you." Clara stared at her, disbelieving. "Thank me? After everything You gave me back the truth," Elizabeth said. "For 3 years I believed the man I loved had abandoned me. I built walls around myself because of it. I turned down good men, kept everyone at a distance, convinced myself I was better off alone." She took a breath. "And then you told me the truth. That none of it was real. That Nathaniel never stopped loving me, and I never stopped loving him, and the only thing that ever came between us was a lie." Her voice grew softer. "You didn't have to tell me any of that, Clara. You could have let me go on believing it forever. But you gave me back the truth instead. And whatever else you've done, that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Elizabeth said. "Just go west, build a good life, and become the woman you might have been if Thomas had never gotten his hands on you." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small purse, pressing it into Clara's hands. "For the journey, and for whatever comes after." Clara looked down at the purse, then back up at Elizabeth, tears spilling freely now. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you being so kind to me?" "Because someone has to break the cycle," Elizabeth said simply. "Thomas spent his whole life taking from people. You spent 4 years being forced to help him, and I could spend the rest of mine holding on to bitterness over what the 2 of you took from me." She shook her head. "But I've decided I'd rather be the person who gives something back. It's the only way any of us ever heals, I think. Someone has to choose kindness, even when cruelty would be easier, even when it's deserved." Clara clutched the purse to her chest, and before Elizabeth could react, threw her arms around her in a fierce, weeping embrace. Elizabeth stiffened for a moment, then slowly, cautiously returned it. "Be well, Clara," she said. "Live a life worth all of this." "I will," Clara promised, pulling back and wiping her face. "I swear to you, Elizabeth, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the mercy you've shown me." Elizabeth left the inn with a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years, the particular peace that comes from choosing at last to set down a weight you've carried far too long. Charlotte's heartbreak healed slowly, the way all real heartbreak does. There were days she barely rose from bed. Days she wept over the man she'd loved who'd never truly existed. But there were also days, more and more of them, as the summer wore into autumn, when Elizabeth caught her sister laughing again, or humming as she worked in the garden, or making plans for a future that once more felt like it belonged to her. "I keep thinking I should feel foolish," Charlotte confessed one evening, as the 2 sisters sat together on the porch watching the sun sink low over the Virginia fields. "For being fooled by him. For loving him." "You're not foolish," Elizabeth said. "You loved someone who lied about who he was. That's not a failing in you, Charlotte. That's a crime committed against you. There's a difference." "You loved Nathaniel," Charlotte said. "And he was real. He was true. And you still lost 3 years to a lie." She turned to her sister. How do you do it, Lizzie? How do you trust anyone again after something like this? Elizabeth considered the question for a long moment. You don't do it all at once, she said finally. You do it in small pieces. You let someone prove themselves a little at a time. You watch how they act when it's difficult, when it costs them something, when no one's watching. And slowly, if they keep choosing, you keep showing up, keep telling you the truth, even when a lie would be easier. Slowly, you learn to trust again. She smiled softly. It's not a leap, Charlotte. It's 1,000 small steps. And the right person will walk every one of them with you. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Is that what Nathaniel's doing? Walking the small steps? Elizabeth's smile widened. He is. And he was. In the weeks after the trial, Nathaniel Whitmore set about proving himself to Elizabeth Carter, with a quiet, steady determination that slowly, piece by piece, dismantled the walls she'd spent 3 years building. He didn't do it with grand gestures or extravagant promises. He did it in the small ways that mattered more. He came to help the Carter family settle their affairs, using his own resources to clear the debts. Thomas had exaggerated, refusing any repayment. He restored the deed to the Loudon land to Elizabeth's name, personally writing to the county seat to ensure every legal detail was properly recorded so that her inheritance could never again be threatened. He asked her opinion on matters concerning his own estate, and he listened, truly listened, when she gave it, treating her intelligence not as a novelty, but as something valuable he'd been foolish to overlook before. And when Elizabeth mentioned one afternoon that she'd always dreamed of managing an estate's accounts herself, of putting her head for figures to real use, rather than merely advising from the sidelines, Nathaniel didn't laugh or dismiss it the way most men of his time would have. Then manage mine, he said simply. God knows I'm terrible at it. My steward's been robbing me blind for years, and I'm too poor with numbers to catch him at it. Elizabeth blinked. You'd let me manage your accounts. I'd be grateful for it, Nathaniel said. There's no one I'd trust more. It was such a small thing in some ways, and yet it meant everything, because it told Elizabeth that the man before her truly saw her not as a decoration to be won, not as a prize to be claimed, but as a person of value in her own right. She took over his accounts within the week, and she caught the thieving steward within the month. Autumn deepened into the golden months that Virginia does so well, and one afternoon in late October, Nathaniel asked Elizabeth to walk with him to the small chapel near the edge of the estate, the same chapel, though neither of them said it aloud, where Charlotte's wedding was to have taken place. I want to ask you something, Nathaniel said as they stood together in the quiet churchyard. And I want you to know that whatever you answer, it changes nothing about how I feel or what I'll continue to do. I'm not asking because I've earned it. I'm asking because I can't go another day without asking. Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster. Nathaniel, 3 years ago, he continued, I asked you to be my wife, and then I let a lie take you from me without a fight. I've spent every day since the trial trying to become a man who would never do that again. A man who fights for what matters. A man who has the courage to choose you, even when it's hard, even when it costs something. He took a breath. I don't know if I've become that man yet, but I know I'll spend the rest of my life trying. And I know I'd rather try beside you than apart from you. He took her hands in his. Elizabeth Carter, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you marry me? Not the powerful gentleman I was 3 years ago. Just me. A man asking humbly for a second chance. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about everything. About the girl she'd been 3 years ago, who would have said yes before he finished the question. About the wounded woman she'd become in the years since, who'd sworn never to trust so completely again. About the person she was now, someone who had learned to stand on her own, who had built a life, who had walked into a church and torn apart a criminal's scheme without flinching, who knew finally and fully exactly what she was worth. When you asked me 3 years ago, she said slowly, I said yes because I couldn't imagine my life without you, because I needed you, because being apart from you felt like it would break me. She held his gaze steadily. That's not why I'm going to say yes today. Nathaniel's breath caught. You're I'm going to say yes, Elizabeth said, not because I need you, but because I've learned to stand on my own, and I've discovered that I want you standing beside me anyway. Not because I can't survive alone, I can. I have. But because a life with you in it is a better life than one without. And I choose it. I choose you. Her voice grew soft, freely, with my eyes open, knowing exactly who you are and exactly who I am. That's the difference, Nathaniel. 3 years ago, I loved you like a girl who was afraid of losing you. Now I love you like a woman who knows her own worth and chooses to share her life with you regardless. Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears. That, he said, his voice breaking, is a far better answer than I ever deserved. Yes, Elizabeth agreed, laughing through her own tears. It is. And then his arms were around her, and hers around him, and 3 years of grief and lies and stolen time dissolved into the simple, unbreakable truth of two people who had found their way back to each other, despite everything the world had thrown between them. They married that winter, in the same chapel on a clear, cold morning with snow dusting the churchyard and the entire county in attendance this time, to witness not a fraud, but something real. Charlotte stood as her sister's witness, radiant, and healed her own heartbreak, finally softened into something she could carry, rather than something that carried her. Margaret Carter wept through the entire ceremony. Tears not of the grief and guilt that had haunted her for months, but of pure, uncomplicated joy at seeing her elder daughter find the happiness that had been stolen from her 3 years before. Even Mrs. Whitmore, who had spent months mortified over her role in bringing Clara Bennett into their lives, found peace at last in watching her son marry the woman he should have married years ago. I always liked her best, Mrs. Whitmore confided to Margaret during the wedding breakfast. Even when Clara was fussing over me and flattering me half to death. There was always something too smooth about that girl. Elizabeth never flattered anyone in her life. She just tells you the truth and lets you make of it what you will. The older woman smiled. That's the kind of woman you want in a family. The kind who tells you the truth. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. No true life ever is. But they were good years built on a foundation that no lie could ever crack again. Elizabeth managed the Whitmore estate accounts with a precision that turned the struggling property profitable within 2 years. Under her careful hand, the debts vanished, the land flourished, and the household prospered in ways it never had, under Nathaniel's well-meaning but hopeless attempts at bookkeeping. But it was not for their wealth that the Whitmore estate became known throughout Virginia. It was for something else entirely. When a family in the county fell on hard times, it was the Whitmores who quietly helped them through the winter. When a young widow found herself cheated out of her late husband's property, a situation that struck too close to Elizabeth's own history to ignore, it was Elizabeth who helped her untangle the legal mess and reclaim what was rightfully hers, refusing any payment for the service. When men came through the county with charming smiles and vague pasts and too-good-to-be-true propositions, it was Elizabeth Whitmore they answered to, and few schemes survived her sharp eyes and sharper questions. She had learned through the hardest possible lesson exactly how a good person could be deceived, and she spent the rest of her life making certain that as few people as possible would suffer the way she had. Nathaniel worked beside her in all of it, the man he'd promised to become, fully realized at last, a man who fought for what mattered, who chose courage over comfort, who never again let a lie stand when the truth needed telling. Years later, a letter arrived at the Whitmore estate postmarked from Ohio. Elizabeth recognized the handwriting immediately, though it had been a long time since she'd seen it. Clara had built a life in the West as she'd promised. She'd married again, a good man this time, a schoolteacher who knew her whole history and loved her anyway. She had 2 children. She taught penmanship to the local children she wrote, and every time she guided a small hand across a slate, she thought of how she'd once used that same skill to destroy lives, and how grateful she was to have been given the chance to use it to build something good instead. I think of you often, Elizabeth, the letter read. You gave me a second chance. I had no right to expect, and I have tried every day to become worthy of it. I don't know if I've succeeded, But I know that I am not the woman Thomas made me. I am someone new, someone I can live with. And I have you to thank for that." Elizabeth read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. The same desk where years before she'd sat unraveling a mystery that had stolen 3 years of her life. "Who was it from?" Nathaniel asked, looking up from the ledger he was pretending to understand. "Clara," Elizabeth said. "She's well, happy even. She married a good man and has children of her own now." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Does it trouble you that she found happiness after everything she took from us?" Elizabeth considered the question the way she'd learned to consider all things, carefully, honestly, without pretense. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't trouble me at all, because the truth is Clara didn't take anything from us in the end. She tried. Thomas tried. They took 3 years, yes, but they couldn't take what mattered." She looked at her husband across the room, at the life they'd built together, at everything they'd fought for and won. "We found our way back to each other. We built something real, something no lie could ever break. And in the end, even Clara chose the truth over the lie and became someone better for it." She smiled. "How could I begrudge her the same second chance that saved my own life?" Nathaniel crossed the room and took her hands in his, the way he had in that churchyard years before. "Do you know what I've learned in all these years?" he said softly. "Tell me that the strongest thing a person can do isn't to survive betrayal," Nathaniel said. "Plenty of people survive betrayal. They just carry it with them forever. Let it harden them. Let it turn them bitter and closed and afraid." He raised her hands to his lips. "The strongest thing a person can do is to survive betrayal and choose anyway to keep believing in truth, in kindness, in love, to let it make them softer instead of harder, braver instead of more afraid." He met her eyes. "That's what you did, Elizabeth. That's what you taught me to do. And it's the reason we have everything we have now." Elizabeth looked at the man she'd loved and lost and found again, at the life they'd built from the wreckage of everything that had tried to destroy them, and she understood with perfect clarity the truth she'd spent so many years learning. A heart can survive betrayal. It can survive lies and loss and years stolen by the cruelty of others. But it can only truly heal when the truth is finally spoken aloud, and when the one who was wounded finds the courage to choose love again, not out of need or fear, but out of the quiet, unshakable strength of knowing exactly who they are and exactly what they are worth. Elizabeth Carter had returned to Virginia for her sister's wedding, expecting only to survive it and leave. Instead, she had found the truth that set her free, reclaimed the love that was stolen from her, protected her family from ruin, and become the strongest, surest version of herself she had ever known. And that woman, the one who told the truth, no matter the cost, who chose kindness over vengeance, who learned to stand alone and then chose freely who to stand beside, that woman would never be broken by anyone's lies again.